Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive.
Yes, great to be here.
Today, we're going to be tackling a topic that I think a lot of parents struggle with,
Oh, yeah.
and that is anger in childhood.
Yes, very common experience.
Yeah, so we're going to kind of go beyond just thinking about the terrible twos and tantrums at the grocery store,
Yeah,
and we're going to be looking at a really fascinating research study
absolutely.
that tracked hundreds of kids for years and years.
Yeah, they followed them from infancy to middle childhood.
Wow.
So literally for years and years.
And they tracked their anger levels over time to see if there were any patterns.
Yeah,
Like, did those patterns predict anything about, behavioral issues later on?
exactly. And what's really cool about the study is it's not just about how often kids get angry.
Right.
It's really about how those anger patterns change over time.
Okay, so like different developmental trajectories.
Exactly. They used a fancy statistical method called group-based trajectory analysis.
It's very technical.
It sounds very complicated, but it's actually pretty elegant.
Okay.
Basically, you can imagine plotting each child's anger level on a graph over time, right? And you would see these distinct pathways emerge.
So like some kids might start off with low anger that stays low, other
Yeah.
kids might be high and then level out.
Exactly. Yeah, and that's really what makes this study so insightful.
Okay, I'm hooked. Tell me
Yeah.
more about these anger trajectories. What did they actually find?
Well, they identified 6 different anger trajectories,
Okay.
which is really cool. Some of them are pretty intuitive, like there's the low stable group.
Okay.
And those kids basically just show consistently low levels of anger throughout the whole study period.
So those are the easygoing kids.
You could say that, yeah. And then there's the average stable group, which was actually the largest group.
Okay.
And, as you might guess, these kids are right in the middle, not super angry, not super chill, just kind of average. And their anger levels stayed pretty consistent over time.
Right. Okay, that makes sense. So those are kind of like the two predictable paths.
Yeah.
Right. Low and then average.
Yeah.
What about the kids whose anger kind of went up and down over time?
Yeah, so we've got a couple of groups where things are changing in really interesting ways. So the average decreasing group starts out with average anger levels, but they actually decrease quite a bit between toddlerhood and preschool.
So they figure how to like chill out a little earlier on.
Yeah, maybe they develop some good coping skills or their environment changes, who knows, but something shifts for them.
That's interesting.
And then you have the average increasing group, which is really fascinating because their anger starts off average,
Okay.
but then it actually increases relative to their peers as they get older.
Oh, that's surprising.
Yeah,
I would think it would be the opposite for most kids.
right. And that's why it's so important to look at these individual pathways because they really tell us a lot about a child's development.
Okay, so we've got the low, the average going down, the average going up. What about the other two groups?
All right, so the last 2 groups are a bit smaller, but they really stood out to me when I was reading the study.
Okay, I have a feeling this is where things get a little more intense.
You could say that, so you've got the high decreasing kids.
Okay.
They start off with high anger, but then there's a significant drop as they get into preschool and beyond.
So a similar pattern to that average decreasing group.
Yeah, but starting from a higher point, and then there's the high stable group. This was the smallest group, but probably the most concerning.
Oh,
These kids just show consistently high levels of anger compared to their peers throughout the whole study.
okay. So basically, out of all those paths, anger can take the kids who are in that high stable group are the ones who might be like waving a red flag.
Exactly. Yeah, and what the researchers found was that this particular trajectory was linked to a much higher risk of developing problems later on.
Problems like what?
So by the time these kids reached age 8, they were significantly more likely to have both what we call externalizing problems like aggression and rule breaking, and also internalizing problems like anxiety and depression.
Oh, wow. So it's not just about them being more likely to be angry. It's about all these other potential issues, too.
Right. It's like this cascade of difficulties that might stem from this one pattern of anger.
That's intense.
It really is. And what's fascinating is that remember that high decreasing group, the ones who started off with a lot of anger but then leveled out?
Yeah.
Many of them made that shift between toddlerhood and preschool.
Interesting. So even for the kids who are struggling with anger early on, there's still hope that things can change.
Yeah, absolutely. And this raises a really interesting question about whether there might be a sensitive period for intervention.
Okay, sensitive period. So like a window of time where support might be extra effective.
Exactly. But we'll dig into that more a little bit later.
Okay, you definitely got my attention.
Good.
So we've got these 6 different anger journeys. Some are bumpier than others.
Right.
But before we get to like the what can we do about it part,
Sure.
I'm curious, Why is anger even a thing in the first place? Like, what's its purpose? Especially for these little tiny humans who are still trying to figure out the world.
That's a great question, and one we often overlook because we're so focused on trying to fix the anger that we forget to understand its function.
Okay, so anger isn't just like a random glitch. It actually has a purpose.
Exactly. It's not just kids being difficult. It's actually a really important part of their development.
Okay, but like, what is that purpose? How is it helpful?
Well, think about it, even for a baby who can't talk yet, anger is their way of communicating.
Oh, yeah, like when they're hungry or tired and they can't tell us with words.
Right, exactly. It's their way of saying, hey, something's not right here, pay attention to me.
So it's like their built-in alarm system.
Exactly. And as kids get older, anger still serves that purpose, but it becomes a little more complex.
Okay, so it's not just about basic needs anymore.
Right. It can be about feeling frustrated or feeling like something's unfair.
Yeah. Like when another kid takes their toy or something.
Exactly. It's their way of setting boundaries, saying, hey, I don't like that.
So it's actually important for them to learn to stand up for themselves.
Exactly. It helps them develop a sense of self and navigate those social situations.
So it's not about teaching kids to never get angry. It's about teaching them how to handle it in a healthy way.
Exactly. And that's something that we all continue to learn throughout our lives.
Yeah, I mean, I'm still working on that.
Me too. It's a lifelong learning curve.
But the more we understand about how anger works, the better equipped we are to help our kids.
Absolutely. We can help them learn to express their anger in a way that's constructive rather than destructive.
Okay, so big picture anger is important, but let's go back to those anger trajectories.
Okay.
Specifically, that high stable group, the kids who just seem to stay really angry.
Right.
What's going on there? Is it just that they have more intense temperaments, or is there more to it?
Well, temperament definitely plays a role. And this is where the study gets really interesting because it was an adoption study.
Oh, okay, so the kids weren't biologically related to their parents.
Right, exactly. And that gives us some clues about the whole nature versus nurture debate.
Right, because if they're not genetically related to their parents, but they still show these patterns.
Exactly. It suggests that genes might create a predisposition, but environment and specifically parenting can have a huge impact on how that anger is expressed.
Okay, so it's kind of like a combination of both.
Exactly. It's not just one or the other.
But how does that play out in real life? Like, what are some things parents can do that might influence a child's anger trajectory?
Well, one of the biggest factors seems to be parental responsiveness.
So how parents respond to their kids.
Exactly, when parents are attuned to their child's needs, when they provide that sense of security and love and consistent guidance, those kids tend to develop better self-control.
So it's not just about reacting to the anger when it explodes. It's about creating that foundation of security from the beginning.
Exactly. And, all those emotion coaching strategies we talked about, validating feelings, setting limits, modeling healthy behaviors, that all falls under this umbrella of responsive parenting.
Right. It's about creating an environment where kids feel safe to express their emotions.
Exactly, even the messy ones.
And that makes sense. If they feel heard and understood, maybe they're less likely to lash out.
That's the idea. And it's also about consistency. Kids thrive on predictability, especially when it comes to boundaries and expectations.
Right, like knowing what the rules are.
If those rules are constantly changing, it can create a lot of chaos and uncertainty.
And that could be really triggering for kids who are already prone to anger.
Exactly. So consistent discipline, but also that warmth and support, it's about finding that balance.
It sounds like a tough balance.
It is. It's not about being permissive, but it's also not about being overly authoritarian.
It's about finding that sweet spot.
Right, where kids feel both loved and guided.
Okay, this is giving you a lot to think about as a parent.
Mm-hmm.
But let's shift gears a bit and talk about what happens when those anger issues persist.
Okay.
What are some of the interventions that can help kids who are really struggling to manage their anger?
Well, one of the most effective approaches is cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT.
CBT. I've heard that one before, but to be honest, I'm not really sure what it is.
So CBT is all about helping kids identify and change those negative thought patterns and behaviors that contribute to their anger.
Okay, so it's like rewiring their brain.
Yeah, kind of. It's about getting to the root of the problem, not just managing the outward outbursts.
So you're not just trying to get them to stop yelling, you're trying to understand why they're yelling in the first place.
Exactly. CBT therapists help kids recognize those triggers, those situations or thoughts that set off their anger,
Okay.
and then they teach them coping skills to deal with those triggers.
So it's a two-pronged approach.
Yeah.
You figure out the why behind the anger, And then you give them tools to handle it.
Exactly. And there are all sorts of CBT techniques that can be helpful.
Like what?
Well, one example is something called cognitive restructuring, which is all about challenging those negative thoughts. So let's say a kid gets angry because they lost a game.
Yeah.
A CBT therapist might help them reframe that thought. Instead of thinking I'm a loser, they might learn to think, okay, I didn't win this time, but I can try again next time.
So it's about shifting their perspective.
Exactly, moving away from those all or nothing thoughts.
Yeah, okay, I like that.
And another key element of CBT is problem solving.
Okay.
So instead of just reacting with anger, kids learn to take a step back, assess the situation, and come up with different solutions.
I can see how that would be helpful, not just for anger, but for life in general.
Absolutely. And then, of course, there are those relaxation techniques we talked about before, deep breathing, mindfulness exercises, things like that.
Right, giving them a way to calm down.
Exactly, regulating those physical responses to anger so they can think more clearly.
So CBT is a pretty powerful tool.
It can be really effective.
Are there other interventions that could be helpful for kids who are struggling with anger? So CBT sounds like it's got a lot of different angles that it tackles anger from.
Yeah, it's a pretty comprehensive approach.
But I imagine it's not like a one-size-fits-all solution for every kid.
Oh, definitely not every child's going to respond to CBT in the same way, and some might need additional support.
Right. So what are some other things that parents and caregivers can consider?
Well, one approach that can be really helpful alongside or even instead of CBT is parent management training, or PMT.
PMT. Okay, so this one is focused on the parents.
Exactly. Remember how we talked about the importance of parental responsiveness and creating that supportive environment?
Yeah, that warm and fuzzy feeling.
Right. Well, PMT is all about giving parents concrete strategies to do just that.
So it's not just like, hey, be more responsive. It's like, here's how you actually do that.
Exactly. PMT programs teach parents how to set clear expectations and boundaries, how to use positive reinforcement effectively, and how to respond to their child's anger in ways that de-escalate the situation rather than making it worse.
Okay, so giving them tools to navigate those tricky moments.
Exactly. And, it can be incredibly stressful for parents when their child is constantly struggling with anger.
Oh, absolutely.
So PMT is really about supporting the parents as much as the child.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
It's like everyone needs a little coaching sometimes.
Exactly. And it's important to remember that PMT isn't about blaming parents or making them feel like they're doing something wrong.
Right.
It's just acknowledging that parenting is hard work and we all need a little extra guidance sometimes.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
So we've got CBT for the kids, PMT for the parents. What other interventions should we have on our radar?
Well, depending on the child's needs, social skills training can also be really beneficial.
Social skills training, okay.
Yeah, especially for kids who might be struggling with peer relationships, which we know can be a common challenge for children who have trouble managing their anger.
Right, because if you're always getting into fights with other kids, it's
Yeah.
going to be hard to make friends.
Exactly. And those social struggles can actually make the anger even worse, creating this kind of vicious cycle.
Oh, that's interesting.
But social skills groups can help break that cycle. Well, they teach children how to interact with others more effectively, how to communicate their needs assertively but respectfully, and how to resolve conflicts peacefully.
So it's like giving them a roadmap for
Sure.
those social situations that can be so triggering.
Exactly. And for some children, particularly those who might have experienced trauma or other significant challenges, play therapy can be really powerful.
Play therapy. I've heard of that, but I don't really know much about it.
Well, play therapy uses play as a way for children to express their emotions and work through difficult experiences in a safe and non-threatening environment.
Oh, that's cool. So like play becomes their language.
Exactly. It allows them to communicate things that might be too hard to put into words.
I love that it really highlights the importance of meeting children where they are.
Absolutely.
But I think it's important to acknowledge that even with all of these interventions and the best parenting, some kids are still going to struggle with anger.
You're absolutely right. And that can be incredibly frustrating for everyone involved.
It really can.
And I think one of the most important messages we can send to parents and caregivers is that it's okay to ask for help.
Yeah, don't be afraid to reach out.
There's no shame in seeking professional support from a therapist or counselor.
Right.
These professionals have specialized training and experience in helping children develop those crucial anger management skills.
And sometimes just having that outside perspective can be so helpful.
Absolutely. It can help parents see things in a new light and find strategies that they might not have considered on their own.
Totally. Well, this has been such a fascinating deep dive into the world of childhood anger.
It's a complex topic, but I think we've covered a lot of ground.
We have. We've talked about the science behind anger, those different anger trajectories, and a whole range of interventions and support systems.
Hopefully our listeners feel like they have a better understanding of this emotion.
I think so, and if there's one key takeaway I hope everyone remembers, it's that anger itself is not the enemy.
That's such an important point. It's a natural human emotion that can actually serve a valuable purpose.
It's about learning to manage it effectively and express it in healthy ways.
Exactly. And with the right support and guidance, every child has the potential to develop a healthy relationship with anger.
I love that, transforming it from a source of frustration into a force for growth.
Exactly.
Well said. That's a great note to end on. Thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive into the world of childhood anger.
It's been a pleasure.
And to our listeners, remember, you're not alone. There's help available, there's hope for every child, and there's power in understanding this complex but essential human emotion.